Hello, and welcome to our first day talking about Tibetan Buddhism. Today we're going to be going over sort of the history of the Tibetan culture as it relates to Buddhism and the integration of Buddhism into Tibetan culture. So Tibetan culture and Tibetan Buddhism, I want to go over some quick fundamentals. We're not going to do a lot of doctrine, especially at this point, because we've talked quite a bit about Buddhism before. So as we progress, we'll start seeing some of the unique evolutions of Buddhism in Tibet. So let's just talk about Tibet a little bit generally. So all Buddhism in general is derived from Indian Buddhism because the Buddha was Indian and that's where Buddhism got started. But the situation in Tibet is a little bit different from what's, say, and found in China or Japan or Sri Lanka. See, Tibetan culture was, of all of the Buddhist cultures, was sort of the least developed culture, as in sort of like the stage of cultural development. They were not necessarily primitive, but they were definitely in like a nomadic, cow herding and warring sort of city states. They weren't even city states, so just constant warring territories when we start seeing Buddhism come in the 7th century. So Tibet also incorporated sort of the latest evolution of Buddhism in India, which would be Mahayana and Vajrayana. One way to think about this is it's in doctrine, it's Mahayana, in practice, it's Vajrayana. So this is a tantric school. And Tantra is thoroughly integrated into almost all levels of practice in Tibetan Buddhism. So many Indians, including sort of like straight up Indian masters, went to Tibet to translate. So many of them even learned Tibetan. Some would work with a council of Tibetans that also knew Sanskrit, and they'd all kind of work together. Some, like say Atisha or Shantarakshita or Sakya Pandita, learned Sanskrit very, very well. We're going to talk about those characters in a few. So there were, in fact, when the Tibetans translated the Indian Tantric and Mahayana canon, they actually preserved a lot of texts that have been sort of lost forever, but you can still find them in Tibetan. That's why I originally learned Tibetan, was to read lost Sanskrit texts. The very script of the Tibetan language was gathered from India. It's derived from an Indian script. There was a king who sent an emissary down to India to learn Sanskrit and to adapt a written language so they could write down Tibetan. So again, there's all these connections to India. So the scripture transmission from India to Tibet is arguably the most complete transmission of Buddhism into any culture. And some argue that it's the most ambitious and sort of sophisticated translation project in human history, which is kind of wild to think about. But there's an awful lot of Sanskrit that got put into classical literary Tibetan. The Tibetan literary culture preserved a great deal of sources from India that have been lost, not just tantras, but even, say, the Vinayas. So the Sanskrit text, like the Mulasarvastivada Vinaya, which is the set of monastic regulations that regulate all of life among monks and in monasteries, we don't actually have that completely preserved in Sanskrit. We do have it in Tibetan. Yes, so there's a lot of reasons to take a look at Tibetan culture and Tibetan Buddhism. So this is Uchen, the Tibetan script right here that I wanted to talk to you a little bit, because it's really odd. As you're reading, I'm sure you noticed that when the Tibetan words are transliterated, they'll have like one word and you're like, okay, I can think about how I pronounce that. And then you have another like stack of like long syllables that don't make any sense. That's the nature of the Tibetan language. And it's a little bit maddening. It took me a long time to get a grasp on it. So the Tibetan language is in its own language group, or Tibeto-Burman languages, which would be Tibet and Burmese. Tibetan and Burmese would be the main ones. How would I describe this language itself? I'd say, well, it has inflected short syllable words that are placed in sequence to make up syntactic units ranging from one syllable to really long syllables. Sentences are often obnoxiously long, and they have no sense of punctuation other than these little spaces and dots that you see between syllables, and those do not break out whole words. That's delightful. And then you'll have like long spaces with a mark at the end that'll mark the end of a syntactic unit. So imagine having all of your punctuation being only periods, only those single periods at the ends of every sentences and no capitalization, and that all of the letters for every word and every sentence do not have any spaces between them. That's Tibetan. They also have these delightful silent consonants. So what do I mean by a silent consonant? I mean that if you look to your right, you'll see a word. Now that is actually SB, or that is actually BSGRUBS. So druple. So BSGRUBS, Busgrubs is actually pronounced droop. And then there's this other word, I have it over here on the left, that says Busgrubs legs, that's pronounced druple. Go figure. The word for Tibet in Tibetan is P-O, which is spelled P-O-D. The word for Dharma is Ch, C-H-O-S. And then another word you hear a lot, Lama, like Dalai Lama, is spelled B-L-A-M-L-A. There you go. That's how it works. Silent consonants. The idea was that originally these consonants were pronounced in some way or another, but they're not pronounced anymore. What it really just comes down for is that if you don't speak any Tibetan, it's really hard to pronounce Tibetan in any language or in any way it's written. So you can't just phoneticize it in order to represent it, because you'll have all these silent consonants will effectively be that you'll have words that are pronounced exactly the same, but are spelled completely differently and have completely different meanings. So that's just a little bit about the Tibetan language. So where is Tibetan Buddhism located? Well, it's practiced in North and Eastern India. It's practiced in Sikkim and Nepal and Ladakh. So those are the small kingdoms around India. It's spoken in Burma, or it's practiced in Burma and Bhutan. We actually have a fair amount of Tibetan Buddhism practiced in China now, not just in the part of China that we call the Tibetan Autonomous Region, which is what would be Tibet proper. And to some degree, Tibetan Buddhism is practiced all over the world. I mean, it's actually one of the most vibrant forms of Buddhism around. They have an active network of translators and teachers from different schools that travel around and teach in a way that, and they also appeal to Westerners in a way that no other real religious group has since maybe Zen Buddhism in the 60s. All right, so Tibetan Buddhism is the fastest growing Buddhist tradition around the world, especially North America. And for that matter, I've spent a fair amount of time at a Dharma center in Columbus, Ohio. That's a Karma Kagyu group called, what is their name again? Karma Triyana Dharma Chakra, which means the karma system that maintains all three wheels of the turning of the Dharma, something like that. Tibetans in the United States are found mostly in New York, in Wisconsin, in Colorado, and in Washington. They tend to go to mountainous places. With nice strong winters, because Tibet is sort of a cold place. So, when you ask Tibetans, like I spent a lot of time with Tibetans in Wisconsin, and I'm like, oh, why wouldn't you ever want to move to California? And they're like, well, Tibetans wouldn't want to live in California. I'm like, why is that? I'm like, oh, we like to have winters. We like to have distinct seasons. They've adapted where they've settled in the United States for historical reasons, but also because those are the types of climates that appeal to them. All right, so the view of Tibetan Buddhism in Western culture is sort of twofold. I like to think of this as being sort of like this yin and yang of Tibetan Buddhism, except it's not a yin and yang at all, because there's no real balance. They aren't two sides of one coin. In one center, you can think of Tibetan Buddhism as being about monks and Tibetans that practice Tibetan Buddhism. It's very human. It's about interactions with royalty. It's about rival religious groups. It's about rival teachers. One of the things you see these Tibetans doing here is they're debating. They have an active version of debate where, and we'll talk about this in monasticism, so it's about conflict and trying to overcome someone else in spiritual thought. It's also about kind of devotional practices and pilgrimage practices. And it's also about the compromised status of Tibet being, to this day, a colony of China. And then on the other side, you have this sort of occult view. This is a long-standing, starting in the 19th century, understanding of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan culture, moreover. Let me move back around that. So starting in the 19th century, there were a lot of people that started writing books and speculating about Tibet being the land of the ancient masters with the wisdom of Atlantis, where everyone was dedicated to their own happiness and spiritual evolution, where psychic powers were really common. Then there were a lot of folk that talked about how the great Tibetan masters were where the great world teachers have retired to Tibet, and we can channel them and come into contact with them and they can give us wisdom. Well, that's hard to imagine once you hang out in Lhasa and get to know Tibetan people. You're like, wow, you people in this religion is just kind of like everything else. So there's a classic movie called Lost Horizon that was based on a book about a bunch of Westerners that go to Tibet, and there they find the wonderful Tibetan people, but they also find immortality and self-enlightenment and whatnot, but they only really interact with other white people there. And it's in that movie that they posit that there's a city called Shangri-La. You may have heard of Shangri-La before, this magical foreign land. Well, supposedly it was in Tibet. No such place actually exists. And this sort of occultic viewpoint, and here's The Third Eye by Tilab Songrampa, who was actually like a white guy, talks about these, Tibetan powers that he has, but he had never had any contact with Tibet. So we have this idea of this magic, mystical Tibet, or in contrast, you're going to get what you get here with me, which is, a Tibetan culture and a Tibetan world and a Tibetan Buddhism that is all too human, but quite intriguing. All right, so one of the other ways that Tibetan culture has been encountered in the West is there's a book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. We're going to do a whole lecture on conscious death techniques. I've got 3 translations up here that I've read all of them over the period of time. So the first one was the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was written by translated by a guy named Evans Wentz, who priorly had written a book about fairy culture in northern Scotland. Then you have the Psychedelic Experience, which is a paraphrase of the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzger, and Richard Alpert, one of whom ended up being Baba Ram Das, and you may have heard of Timothy Leary. And then you have the Tibetan Book of the Dead translated by Robert F. Thurman, that's Uma Thurman's father. So between these, they're very different translations, but they've all had a profound effect on Western culture. Arguably, when we hear about people talking about near-death experiences, they always say, I saw this great light. Well, we start seeing people describing this great light, that they see this light at the end of the tunnel and whatnot in near-death experiences all around the same time. And it was right after some interpretations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead really made it into Western culture and Western popular understanding. So when you hear somebody say, I saw a great light, think, aha! Someone's influenced by Tibet, whether they realize it or not. So in this unit, we're going to be discussing the history of Tibetan Buddhism, and we're going to look at monasticism and the 4 main vehicles of, the 4 main sects of Tibetan Buddhism. We're going to talk about ritual techniques, and then we're going to talk about conscious death techniques and meditations on death. I think these are sort of the 4 most important things for understanding Tibetan culture as just an introduction. But remember, it's not monolithic. I mean, Tibetans are very different depending on the regions they come from and places that they've now settled in diaspora. And it's also, a lot of these arguments aren't necessarily as clearly agreed upon when you really start talking to people. So prior to Buddhism, we're moving into our history section here. Prior to Buddhism in the 7th century, Tibet was ruled by various kings. And there was a sort of cult of the divine king and a cult of kingship. The ideals were that the king would descend upon the earth from heaven, but he would retain this like golden cord from his belly button. It would go up to heaven his whole sort of life. The king was thought to have descended from heaven and retain this umbilical sort of tether that was connected to the sky. The king would then rule until his son was old enough to ride a horse, and then he would return to the heavens, presumably climbing up that golden cord that had been at his belly for his whole life. The 8th king actually lost the favor of his tutelary deity, his war deity, and his umbilical cord was cut, and he died in battle. Ever since then, the kings have no longer been immortal. We know that these sort of cults to divine kingship and to divine kings were accompanied by quite a lot of animal sacrifices. And we know that the folks that did them were known as chanters and others known as diviners. So we know there were people chanting some sort of oral literature going along with this cult, so none of it is preserved. All right, so one thing that is important to explain here is that there developed an idea that amongst these divine kings, there was this idea that there was this divine soul. The word for soul is hla. We'll see it all the time here. And that the moment that the king ascended to the crown, it was as if that soul of divine kingship would come into him. And then when he was done and ready to retire, it would leave him and go into his son that would go on the crown. So I want you to think of this sort of divine soul or divine presence that enters a king, because we're going to see it. We're going to see in the 1300s the monastics get a similar idea so that they can have what's called a tulku. And I'll say this again in a minute, but I'll really quickly go over it right now. A tulku is someone who consciously dies and then immediately goes into the next body. And it is as if the brains are still connected. They call it connecting the pipe. So in this way, a soul can, not really a soul, but the essence of a person can live through many, many lives. So the 14 Dalai Lamas are all thought to be the same person who at the end of life dies in a specific conscious way and can completely and flawlessly enter the next life. Okay, so after this sort of cult of the divine kingship, we have our first king. He ruled from 614 to 650. His name is Sonsan Gampo. The original stories are, and a lot of these are conflated and were kind of more propagandized toward the end. He is, let's see, how do I explain this best? So Sonsan Gampo supposedly had some sort of a treaty with Tibet or with China and Nepal, so he got two wives. He got a Chinese wife and a Nepali wife, both of whom were Buddhists, and they converted him to Buddhism. And he also, so we know that, you know, he has some sort of a bridging of like Indian and Chinese Buddhist culture to create the first sort of Buddhism that we see in Tibet. He also sent one of his ministers down to India to learn Sanskrit and to to get a script for them. So his emissaries would have learned Sanskrit, and then they would have found an Indian writing system and used that to adapt to the Tibetan written language. Before the 7th century, so the 600s, there is no writing in Tibet. Okay, so the land of Tibet, and this is kind of an important tale to see. If you see this image I have up top here, it's of a demon woman, a demoness. The idea is that the land of Tibet itself is a demoness. And what happens is you have these various heroes, such as Gesar of Ling, who is supposed to be one of the absolute first heroes of the Tibetan culture, and is later considered to be an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara. Remember, we've heard about him before, the Buddha who looks down, the Buddha of ultimate compassion, who also ends up being Kuan Yin in China. So Avalokiteshvara becomes Gesar of Ling, or Gesar of Ling becomes a monkey. Yes, I said it. And the monkey has sex with, makes love to this supine demoness, who's the very body, all of Tibet is thought to be. And then the idea is that from that Congress makes the Tibetan people. So yeah, people tell you this story all the time. Tibetans are fond of this story. And then what Sonsan Gampo did was he built Buddhist temples all over the place, and supposedly that held the demoness down. Because there's like a temple at her wrist and a temple at her hip and a temple at her knee, and then she couldn't move around and cause all sorts of problems. We'll come up to another figure who did something really similar. There is a bit of historical ambiguity. We don't really know that much historically about Sonsan Gampo. Odds are he was somewhat Buddhist, but was probably really still engaged in this cult of kings. Now, Trisong Detsen, who ruled from 754 to 797, we get a little bit more of a Buddhist. So I like to think of him as being really the first Buddhist king of Tibet. So this king chose Buddhism over the sort of divine cult. So he was like, I'm done with this. I'm going to be a Buddhist. That's going to be my thing. He does perform in some historical records, a bit of like sacrificial stuff still, but likely he was associated with Buddhism for the most part. I mean, still, there's some ambiguity. I mean, why would you want to give up a cult of yourself being a king? However, Tristan Detsen called forth 2 Indians to come to Tibet, and they had very different functions and become huge figures in the history of Tibetan Buddhism. The first was named Shantarakshita, and he was an Orthodox Mahayana Buddhist monk. He would have been your character, or he would have been your sort of standard Orthodox teacher. And he brought the sutras to Tibet, so the philosophies of Mahayana Buddhism. He had all of the wisdom that one could need to be a great Buddhist teacher, but he didn't have sort of the power that he needed. And what do I mean by power? I mean sort of like magical potency. So you can guess what's going to happen next. The local deities are angered by him being there and bringing in this Buddhism, and they're just causing a ruckus. So Tristan Detsen, what he does is he calls another guy, Padmasambhava. Now, Padmasambhava is a tantric yogi, and he probably came from the northwest of India. He rolls in with all the tantric juju in the world, and he overcomes, overpowers, and converts the local deities. He's also said to have hid scriptures all over Tibet. Yeah, literally, like he went and wrote scriptures and like hid them like in a mountain cave or whatnot. And they call these termas. Terma means treasure. So what the idea is that these scriptures remain hidden until humanity really needs them. And the minute humanity really needs them, they are discovered. People that professionally discover these termas, these treasure texts, are called tertans. So the notion here is that Padmasambhava created scriptures that are still found to this day whenever they are needed. All right, so Tristan Detsen also built Samye Monastery. That's the first monastery that was born in, or that was created in Tibet. Now, a little bit later, at Samye, a disciple of Shantarakshita named Kamalashila debated and defeated a group of Chan Chinese Buddhists, and Tristan Detsen is in charge and is the judge. So here's what happens. They're hanging out at Samye, Chinese Tibetans roll up, or Chinese roll up, they're Chan Buddhists, and they start talking about the beautiful, perfect nature of mind and instant enlightenment through meditative practice. And Shantarakshita's guy comes forward and is like, no, you gotta go with the Indic system of ritual, this type of meditation, gradual attainment. Tristan Detsen says, okay, Shantarakshita's boy, you get to win. So, oh yeah, his name's Kamalashila. And from then on, there was never really a big influence upon Tibetan Buddhist cultures by the Chinese. That was kind of it. All right, so now that actual debate probably didn't happen, but what this debate tells us is that there was a time that Chan Buddhism and Chan Buddhist missionaries were in a conflict with the Indian missionaries, and the Indians won out. And for the most part, Tibetan Buddhism is more Indic than it is connected to any other culture. All right, so we're moving forward. We have a ruler from 1815 to 1835 named Rinpoche. He's important because he oversaw bringing even more scriptures to Tibet. He brought tantras and shastras. So tantras being ritual texts, shastras being sort of philosophical texts. These would have been understandings of scriptural categories in India and in China to some degree. And up to the end of Rinpoche's rule, this is what we call the first dissemination of Buddhism, or the Nyingma tradition, the old tradition. We're going to see that there's another one in a minute. So this is the first dissemination of scriptures from India into Tibet. All right, so after Rinpoche, we get a wicked king. This is the wicked king Langdharma. Now, that's not Dharma, Dharma. So Langdharma, in fact, ruled from 836 to 842, so that's not very long. And he supposedly persecuted Buddhism. Now, he becomes a sort of like archetypal wicked king for all Tibetans and Tibetan cultures, and they tell all these stories about him, how he, forced monks to disrobe and how he destroyed scriptures and whatnot. What we do see is that he had withdrawn patronage from the Tibetan Buddhist community. So, you know, this is kind of a thing that happens in the history of religions, is when a ruler says, like, no, you know what, I'm going to give you less money. Suddenly they're like, oh, you're sacrificing children. You're the worst preacher in the world. So it's a bit of blackening the devil, is a phrase that I've heard. I like that phrase. I actually, there's a story, and it's legendary, and I kind of buy it, that he was actually killed by a Buddhist monk who managed to shoot him with an arrow. So Buddhist monk killing somebody, and then there's all this like contorted logic about how it was right for the monk to kill a person because that person was oppressing the Dharma, and things get confusing when you start trying to use that argument. So after the time of Langdharma's assassination, there's this dark period where traditionally people were like, nah, nothing was written, nothing of interest. There were no new texts coming in from India. In reality, as other scholars have looked back on this period, it was a time when a lot of folk were writing. They weren't bringing in new scriptures, but they were doing all sorts of interesting and innovative scriptures that just haven't been studied, and we're only studying now. This is just like, whereas in the Dark Ages in the West, people were like, nah, there was no real writing on anything. But when you really go back and look, there was tons of scholarship going on. It just wasn't sort of the classical high scholarship of before. Coming to the year 1000, we see a big change. We see a revival of Buddhism in what we call the second dissemination. So at this point, the rulers start bringing in a lot more Indians again. The most important one would be a character named Atisha. Now, Atisha, who lived from 982 to 1054, was a Bengali master, and he was invited to come to Tibet. And he got there, and he evidently liked it, and he spent the rest of his life translating and teaching in Tibet. He had a disciple named Drondon. Notice how weird that's spelled, Drondon. So Drondon was really devoted to him, and after Atisha died, Drondon, his disciple, set up the first monastic order in Tibet. They're called the Kadambas. Now, Drondon was known for being a very good scholar, but being very strict in his religious practices. And evidently, he was worried about the tantras being misused, so he had really strict regulations for the Kadambas, and they didn't last. They don't exist anymore. This is also the point where you see three religious figures who are very important. Naropa was a guy who was a master of tantric yoga. And he set out 8 specific types of yoga that range from dream yoga to karma yoga to sexual yoga to the different meditative forms of yoga. He was an Indian guy, and then he taught a translator named Marpa, who was a Tibetan guy. And so Marpa brings back Naropa's teachings on these very specific yogas, and he starts teaching them. Well, he's approached by a guy named Milarepa, who was when he was a young man, had a whole bunch of trouble with his family and used sorcery to kill a whole bunch of warlords. So he had some really bad karma. He approaches Marpa, and Marpa's like, yeah, I'm not helping you unless you go and rebuild those towers up there. So he starts doing almost like the acts of Hercules, where he builds all these like towers for Marpa, and Marpa comes up and says, no, I want them over there. And like has to keep moving these towers along. And the story is that he works so tirelessly and just beats up his body and just works and works and works for like 12 years. And finally Marpa's like, all right, I'll teach you. You've burned off all your bad karma. He teaches him all this yoga, and Milarepa becomes one of the most famous yogis and prophets in Tibetan Buddhism. During this time, however, sort of historically, there was a decline in being like specific ruling empires, and there were just lots of different dynasties. Different families which were ruling sort of these different areas at the time, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what I mean to say is we're going to see a pattern later where you won't see a single usual king in Tibet, but you'll see rule being spread by what they call by their military, by their aristocracy, and by the monastics. This really starts in here. There is an important sort of there is an important point I wanted to make here is when we're talking about the works that Atisha started and the works of sort of like Marpa, Milarepa, and Naropa, this is what's called the New School. So New School is Sarma. So Nyingma, Old School, and Sarma, New School. The first and second dissemination of Buddhism to Tibet. So in this time period, we also see the beginning of the institution of tulkus. A tulku is a reincarnated soul. A bodhisattva takes the vow to always come back as long as there are sentient beings that are suffering. The idea is there are some folks that are so advanced that they can come back nearly immediately, well, within 49 days. They enter a body and they retain all of their memories, and they're basically the same person. So then folks go around and try to figure out who these guys are. Who are these reincarnations? Usually what will happen is a big teacher will die, and then they'll start looking. And they'll usually find a kid. There'll be some prophecy. There's usually 4 different kids always. And they get the kids together, and they have them kind of look at a whole bunch of items and try to identify, you know, the spectacles or the walking stick or the robes from the last life to prove that they are the same person in a child. Now, the interesting thing is that if that is the case, then that is legally the same person, and the child then inherits what that elderly teacher owned, whether that be religious authority or straight up wealth. And intriguingly, it usually ends up being that people come back as their own nephews. In this way, because Tibet, like most places, you inherit from your father, in this way we could have an older monk basically inherit all his wealth to a soon coming younger monk. And if they manipulate it just right, that person could be related to them, and you can juke with the system. One of my friends always said, well, when they got to figure out who's been reincarnated and to find a tulku, it usually comes down to who is whose cousin. So the Dalai Lama is the most famous of the tulkus. He has supposedly come back, well, he's come back eternal times in the past, but he's come back as the Dalai Lama 14 times. He has actually said that he doesn't know if he's going to come back next time. It's an intriguing argument, but it's not just the Dalai Lama. There's 3,000 other sort of lines of tulkus. So there's 3,000 sort of institutions of people that are being reborn and reborn and reborn, and they're making this connection from life to life. Also at this time, we're going to see that all right, here we go. Also, we're going to see in the second dissemination that while hold on, okay, let me put it this way. You have 4 main vehicles of the Dharma or sects. You have the Nyingma, the Kagyu, the Shakya, and the Gelugpa. The Nyingma used the first dissemination. They never got on board with that second translation. The Nyingma also have that treasure tradition. They say Padmasambhava was actually in their lineage, and he hid those texts for them. So that's their thing. Now the Kagyu, Shakpa, and Gelugpa I'm going to talk about kind of briefly because we're going to go over them a little more extensively in the next lecture. Are sort of the second dissemination types of schools, and they all have some pretty big political implications. So from the 1100s to the 1200s, you see that the Sakya school really becomes ascendant, which is intriguing because they don't exist today. They died out, but they had for a couple hundred years, they had incredible power throughout Tibet. Now, the Sakyas were originally into what's called Lamdre, the path and its achievement. This is a tantric path for speedy realization and gaining of great prosperity. It's very ritually heavy and dedicated to a deity named Hevajra, who is the Buddha that's found in one of the earliest Tibetan tantras, the Hevajra Tantra. But over time, they became really scholastic. They became known as great intellectuals. So one guy I want to talk to you about, who's kind of the most important, is a guy named Sakya Pandita. Now, he had a longer Tibetan name, but they gave him this one, which means sort of the pundit or the great scholar of the Sakyas. And for my money, he actually wrote some of the most beautiful literature I've ever read in Tibetan language. I think Sakya Pandita is probably the best Tibetan writer around. And a bunch of those Dalai Lamas were no dopes. I mean, they were really good. But he has an elegance of writing in the Tibetan language that's just sort of stunning. So Sakyapandita was known for being a prominent debater. He would always take the side of Indian Madhyamaka, or Indian Buddhist logic, and he was very effective, to the point that he would even beat down Indian masters that would come up to debate him. He was a great translator into Tibetan, and he wrote a couple of his own books in Tibetan on logic that were taken by Indians back to India, where they were actually translated into Sanskrit, which does not happen very often. Indian texts go into Tibetan. Tibetan texts don't go into Indian languages. That just doesn't happen. Well, that's not true. These days, so many Tibetans live in India that a lot of them speak Hindi. Okay, so Sakyapandita was kind of really important because he has this political connection. So in 1244, Sakyapandita is called to the court of the Mongol prince Godan Khan. So Godan Khan is the big Khan, the big emperor of Mongolia at the time, and he for the last 4 years or so had been messing with Tibet and raiding it every now and then, occasionally invading. But he decides to call up Sakyapandita up there. So the Khan, Godan Khan, is so impressed with Sakyapandita's eloquence and learning, and more so his magic powers, that he kept him on his court. He was like, no, I'm going to keep you here in my royal court. I like having you around. And in fact, I want you to be the sort of de facto ruler of Tibet. So in this way, Sakyapandita and the Sakya school of Buddhism ends up becoming the dominant rulers of Tibet because of their association with this Mongol king. Now, let's remember that the Mongol Yuans were controlling China from 1260 to 1368. Now, Sakyapandita had a nephew named Pakpa. Now, Pakpa actually was taken into the court of the Chinese Yuan Mongol king, Kublai Khan, who was the great Mongol Chinese emperor. And what happened was he was also so impressed with Pakpa's magical powers and medicine that he made him his personal teacher and made him the sort of satellite ruler of Tibet. So again, even with a connection to a Chinese Mongol dynasty, the Sakyas gained power in Tibet. When the Yuan Mongols declined, so did the Chinese influence on Tibet, and kind of so did the Sakyas. I mean, you get some, and then what you see for the rest of this time before the next period I want to talk about is that the Kagyus and the Shakyas sort of duke it out, and then comes another group called the Gelugpas who come in and they sort of take all the marbles. So the Gelug school is the school of the Dalai Lamas. And remember that the Dalai Lamas at a certain point, as we'll see from the 5th onward, become basically the kings of Tibet, the priest kings of Tibet. So the Gelugpas were founded by a brilliant logician and scholar named blah, blah, blah. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have given you these dates before. So we have let's look at these. The Ming Dynasty was from 1368 to 1644, and then the Qing Dynasty, you have the 720 to 1912. In all of these relationships, you have Tibetans working with the Chinese. So let me go over this again. All right, so there's this overlap with Chinese and Tibetan religious authority. So the Ming Dynasty from 1368 to 1644 used Tibetan Buddhism, namely the Gelug, Kagyu, and Shakya schools, as their own private religious actors to do all their religious rituals. So they were like secretly Tibetan Buddhism. And the same thing we see in 1720 to 1912, where the Qing Dynasty had this very close relationship with Tibetan monks. And again, they had this idea like, all right, you priests will kind of rule this area and we'll take care of you as long as you're good priests for us. So it's sort of like a reciprocal relationship. Okay, so up come the Dalai Lamas. So the Gelugpas were founded by this brilliant writer and logician named Tsongkhapa, they often call him Je Tsongkhapa, who lived from 1357 to 1419. So he starts this Gelugpa school. This would be the first school so far that we've seen that wasn't founded by an Indian, so by an ethnic Tibetan, somebody who'd never been to India. All right, so he wasn't attached to any specific Indian. He was a powerful debater. Later, he gets called an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara again. And his main form of school is called, the main type of logic he uses is called Madhyamaka, so the middle way of logic. In Tibetan, it's called Uma, and intriguingly, Uma Thurman is named after Madhyamaka. So Robert Thurman, the professor at Columbia, named his daughter after a school of Indian Buddhism in Tibet. There you go. So the first Dalai Lama actually ends up being Tsongkhapa's disciple Gendrup, or Gendendrup. So that he lived from 1391 to 1447. These guys are the Geluks. They are, you see the picture above there, they are also known as the guys with the yellow hats. They have yellow hats. The Kagyus have red hats. There you go. Now, these Dalai Lamas start getting more and more powerful. The third Dalai Lama, by name of Sonam Gyatso, was once again summoned to the Mughal court in 1578. He was actually, at that point, given the name Dalai Lama. They had this idea that there were these sort of powerful figures that were reincarnating, but they weren't called the Dalai Lama. They actually, they spoke his formal name, Sonam Gyatso, which means like auspicious, it's like auspicious oceanic, or oceanic auspicious in the Mongolian, and the Mongolians translated into the Mongolian language Dalai Lama, which means ocean lama. So the very term Dalai Lama is a Mongolian term. So he gets called to the Mongol court. They like him quite a bit. They say that they'll back his plays in Tibet. And then the Mongols come and do the same for the fourth. And then by the time you get to the fifth Dalai Lama, that fifth Dalai Lama is backed by the Mongols, absolutely, and they declare him the king of Tibet. So from the fifth Dalai Lama to the 14th Dalai Lama, these guys were basically like the kingly president of Tibet, and also the most important religious figure in Tibet, which you don't often see. They were all prolific writers, some more than others, but all quite elegant. You can actually just sit and read about the different Dalai Lamas for, I don't know, probably a year. They're really quite interesting. So the fifth Dalai Lama becomes an actual secular leader. So he becomes not only the main priest and most evolved religious person, but the most powerful political ruler as well. He actually moved the capital of India, or the capital of his rule, to Lhasa. Lhasa is the capital of Tibet today. It's where all of the legendary kings used to live. Lhasa means sort of like the land or field of the gods. He also started building the Potala Palace, which you see here on the left, and it's fully formed level. How does that not look like a fortress? So that's a monastery in addition to being the home of the Dalai Lama. So yeah, everything about that. So he moves to Lhasa like a king. He builds a fortress like a king. So the fifth Dalai Lama, very much kingly. So yes. So the fifth Dalai Lama was sort of a full-on ruler. He is also the one that is declared to be an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara. Once again, so the national deity of Tibet. Remember, Avalokiteshvara's mantra is Om Mani Padme Om reverence to him who bears the lotus. Yeah, bears Om to him who bears the lotus and the jewel. Om Mani Padme Om. Oh yeah, reverence to him who bears the lotus and the jewel. Most people say it means Om, the jewel and the lotus, but that doesn't actually really make sense in Sanskrit or in Tibetan. So what happens is you have this legendary king called Gesar of Ling, the one who I told you before, who took on the form of the monkey and slept with the supine demoness that is the very body of Tibet, bearing out all children. Then you also have him later getting called an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara. And if the Dalai Lama is an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, that means the Dalai Lama is not only a descendant of the founder of the Geluk school, is also an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, and that means he's also connected to Gesar Ling, the most legendary king in Tibetan culture. The fifth Dalai Lama also found an intriguing idea, and he declared that his tutor, the guy that taught him, to become the Panchen Lama. Now, the Panchen Lama is the second most powerful Lama and religious figure in Tibetan Buddhism, and is also the one who is charged with finding and recognizing each new Dalai Lama. All right, so from the 18th and 19th centuries, you see that the Gelug's get all the control. They align themselves with the ruling Qing dynasty, working as their personal priests, especially the Manchus in the northeast of China. They build monasteries everywhere. There were so many Gelugpa monasteries. They become one of the most important parts in Tibetan ruling society, because Tibet is ruled by a combination of monastics, by the aristocracy called the Kashak, and the military. They would all kind of triangulate, but the monastics would usually end up winning. With the fall of the king in 1912, you see the rise of the Maoists, and things start to get ugly for Tibet. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army invaded and annexed Tibet, or what we now call the Tibetan Autonomous Region, became a colony of China. Tibet's relationship with China changed from anything they'd had before, which was usually kind of like some sort of a backing of certain dynasties and getting protections from other dynasties and just kind of working it out. At this point, the Chinese straight up ruled Tibet, and they started cracking down on religious buildings, religious institutions, religious practice. I mean, one, they cracked down on all religion at this time. But two, because the monks were so often political leaders or were involved with political leaders or the aristocracy or the military, it kind of makes sense for the PLA to try to weaken religious institutions. On March 17th, 1959, the Dalai Lama fled to India, where he lives today, along with many of his followers. The Tibetan exile government operates out of India. They've rebuilt the big monasteries, especially Sera Monastery, which was the monastery founded by Tsongkhapa, belonging to the Gelugs, has been rebuilt in South India, and it's a huge monastery. From 1959 to 1979, you have the Chinese sort of cultural revolution that gets really bad in the 70s. At this point, the Chinese policies killed over 1/6 of all Tibetan people. They destroyed almost all of the monastery. They burnt innumerable books that we will never get back. They forced monks to disrobe. And countless monasteries were raided and destroyed, but we do remember that these monasteries often function as fortresses and armories. It's a dark time in Tibetan history. So in the last 30 years, the Chinese have sort of relaxed their persecution of religion in general and of the Tibetans, but it's still really controlled. Tibetan Buddhism, I mean, there's the Potala Palace on the right with the Chinese flag, the Chinese overseeing it, which is absolutely strange. You see the Dalai Lama hanging out as an important political figure of the Tibetans in exile in India and around the world. And on the left there, you can see the current sort of Tibetan exile government ruling body. That was at a meeting with, I believe, the French and I think the Taiwanese. I can't remember for sure. So, but you can see the Tibetan flag there. So the question that the Chinese always say is that Tibet has always been a part of China, and Tibetans say, no, it's never been a part of China, when in reality, we see that there was always quite a bit of back and forth in the politics and understanding of who owned what space. However, yeah, the Chinese story is horrible, and it's on the down slope of this culture. It's really sad. But on the other hand, Tibetan Buddhism is incredibly vibrant. And to this point, all over China, people are starting to practice Tibetan Buddhism. So while Tibet has been in many ways destroyed, even though many people still live there, the culture has been completely shifted toward a secular Chinese environment. And the Chinese actually have flooded tons of people into there, so the point that the Chinese will soon start to outnumber Tibetans in Tibet. And while that has occurred, Tibetan Buddhism has spread around the world in a way that perhaps it wouldn't otherwise. I think even the Dalai Lama has said maybe it's okay that the Chinese destroyed Tibet. Well, he didn't really mean that, but for us to have this where we can spread this religion throughout the world. It's hard to say. It's a bit of a down note. Sorry to end on a little bit of a sad point. So have a good one. Be well. Be good to one another. Take care of yourselves.